A woman confesses to killing her husband. Her father, a retired federal agent, confesses too. A jury convicts them both of murder. And then, years later, they walk free. This is not a cold case. This is not a mystery with an unknown perpetrator. This is a case where nearly every fact was admitted from the very first night, and where the legal system still took nearly a decade to decide what those facts actually meant. This is the story of Molly Martins Corbett, the killing of her husband Jason Corbett, and one of the most legally contested homicide cases in North Carolina history. Welcome back to Cold Justice. If you're new here, we cover real, verified cases from across the country, drawn from court records, law enforcement reports, and trial testimony. Today, we stay in North Carolina, and we look at a case where the question was never who did it, but why, and whether the answer the courts eventually accepted was the right one. Before we begin, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next case. Drop a like if you want to see more North Carolina files, and let us know in the comments what you think happened behind that bedroom door on the night of the 2nd of August, 2015. Let's get into it. Jason Corbett was born and raised in Limerick, Ireland. By his mid-20s, he had built a career in business and started a family with his wife, Margaret, known to friends and family as Mags. Together they had 2 children, a son named Jack and a daughter named Sarah. In November of 2006, Mags died suddenly after suffering an asthma attack at the family's home in Ireland. Jason was left a widower in his early 30s, raising 2 young children alone. Sometime after his wife's death, Jason hired a young American woman named Molly Martins to help care for his children. Molly was originally from Knoxville, Tennessee, in her mid-20s at the time, and had worked previously as a nanny and a model. She moved to Ireland to take on the role of au pair for Jack and Sarah. Over time, the relationship between Jason and Molly shifted from professional to romantic. The two were married in 2011. Following the marriage, the family relocated from Ireland to the United States, eventually settling in a home in Walbug, in Davidson County, North Carolina. On paper, it looked like a story of a grieving father finding love again, and 2 children gaining a stepmother after losing their own. That is the narrative that circulated for years. But underneath it, according to testimony that would later be presented in 2 separate criminal trials, was a household under significant strain. By the summer of 2015, Jason and Molly's marriage had reportedly become tense. Court records and testimony from the eventual trial describe a couple who were, according to some witnesses, discussing separation and disagreeing over custody arrangements for Jack and Sarah. Molly's parents, Thomas and Sharon Martins, lived in Knoxville, Tennessee. Thomas Martins was a retired agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. According to reporting on the case, Thomas and his wife had made a last-minute decision to travel from Tennessee to North Carolina on the 1st of August, 2015, changing plans that had reportedly been made earlier. That evening, according to a neighbor named David Fritsch, Jason spent time at his home, where the 2 men did yard work together and had a couple of beers. Fritsch would later testify about Jason's demeanor that evening, describing him as calm and in good spirits, a detail that would become relevant when the defense later argued Jason was intoxicated and violent later that night. Thomas and Sharon Martins stayed the night at the Corbett home, sleeping in a bedroom down the hall from Jason and Molly. What happened in the early hours of the following morning would become the subject of 2 criminal trials, 1 appellate reversal, a state Supreme Court ruling, and eventually, a resolution that satisfied almost no one completely. At approximately 3:05 in the morning on the 2nd of August, 2015, Thomas Martins placed a call to 911 from the Corbett home in Walbug, North Carolina. According to police reports, the caller identified himself and stated that he had been in an argument with his son-in-law and had struck him with a baseball bat. Emergency responders arrived at the home shortly after the call and found Jason Corbett, age 39, in the bedroom he shared with Molly. He had sustained severe head trauma. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Molly Martins Corbett and her father, Thomas Martins, were both present in the home. Neither fled the scene, and neither denied involvement in Jason's death from the earliest stages of the investigation. Their account, from the very beginning, was that the death occurred during a physical confrontation and that their actions were taken in self-defense and in defense of one another. According to the written statement Molly gave to the Davidson County Sheriff's Office that day, she said Jason woke up upset An argument followed, and he applied pressure to her throat during the confrontation. She stated that she screamed, that her father entered the room, and that at some point the confrontation escalated to the point where Jason was struck with a baseball bat, which Thomas Martins had brought into the room, and that she herself struck Jason with a decorative brick that had been kept in the bedroom. This account, provided within hours of the killing, would form the foundation of the defense's argument for the next several years. Davidson County Sheriff's investigators processed the scene as what one investigator would later describe, in trial testimony, as one of the most extensive scenes of blood evidence encountered in the department's experience. On the 3rd of August, 2015, a medical examiner with the North Carolina Office of the Chief Medical Examiner performed an autopsy on Jason Corbett. The autopsy determined the cause of death to be blunt force trauma to the head and documented extensive skull fractures. The report also noted lacerations to the scalp consistent with multiple impacts, as well as bruising on other parts of the body, including under one eye and on the back of one hand. Investigators noted that the injury pattern indicated that Jason had been struck a substantial number of times, though the medical examiner testified that the overlapping nature of the injuries made an exact count difficult to determine, a detail that would prove significant throughout the case. Neither Molly nor Thomas Martins showed injuries consistent with the kind of violent, sustained physical struggle they described. Investigators and prosecutors would repeatedly return to this point, that if Jason had been actively strangling Molly and combative enough to require repeated blows from two people, some corresponding injury would likely be present on at least one of them. The murder weapons were identified as an aluminum baseball bat and a concrete paving stone, sometimes described in reporting as a decorative brick, that had reportedly been kept in the bedroom as an ornamental item. Investigators also raised questions about the timeline. The 911 call was placed at approximately 3:05 in the morning, but forensic evidence and later testimony would suggest that Jason may have died some time before that call was made, raising questions about what occurred and for how long before help was summoned. Additional questions emerged around the bat itself. Thomas Martins told investigators he retrieved the bat because he had brought it as a gift for his step-grandson, Jack. However, investigators found information suggesting the bat had actually been given to Jack the previous summer and had been stored in the garage, not brought as a gift that visit, a detail that, if accurate, undercut part of the explanation for why the bat was accessible in the bedroom at all. Molly Martins Corbett, then 31 years old, and her father, Thomas Martins, 65 years old at the time, were arrested and charged in connection with Jason's death. In January of 2016, a grand jury unsealed indictments charging both with second-degree murder, along with voluntary manslaughter as an alternative charge. Both entered pleas of not guilty the following month, maintaining that their actions were carried out in self-defense. Davidson County Sheriff David Grice described the investigation as extremely thorough and stated that his department was satisfied with the grand jury's decision to move forward with charges. The case quickly drew international attention. Because Jason Corbett was Irish, and his death occurred an ocean away from his birthplace and his surviving family members there, the case became a significant story in both the United States and Ireland. It also triggered a bitter custody dispute over Jack and Sarah Corbett, who were, at the time, minor children caught between their stepmother and their late father's family in Ireland. That custody dispute would ultimately be resolved in favor of Jason's family, with Jack and Sarah's aunt and uncle in Ireland gaining custody of the children. Jury selection began on the 17th of July, 2017, at the Davidson County Superior Court in Lexington, North Carolina, before Judge David Lee. Both Molly Martins Corbett and Thomas Martins pleaded not guilty to second-degree murder, arguing that the killing was committed in self-defense and in defense of a family member. On the 25th of July, 2017, Assistant District Attorney Alan Martin laid out the prosecution's case to the jury. He described the extent of Jason's head injuries, noting that the number of individual blows could not be precisely determined by the medical examiner due to the overlapping nature of the wounds. He also noted that toxicology results showed the presence of trazodone, a sedative, in Jason's system, a medication he had never been prescribed, but one that records showed had been prescribed to Molly just days before his death. The prosecution used this detail to suggest that Jason's ability to physically threaten two adults simultaneously may have been diminished, undermining the defense's self-defense narrative. The prosecution's theory centered on the argument that the killing was not a spontaneous act of self-defense, but one connected to ongoing tension in the marriage, including disputes over the children and the future of the relationship. Prosecutors pointed to the absence of significant injuries on either Molly or Thomas Martins as evidence that the level of force used was disproportionate to any threat that existed. The defense, led by attorneys for both Molly and Thomas Martins, presented a different account. Thomas Martins testified that he woke to the sound of a disturbance, grabbed the aluminum bat, and went to his daughter's room, where he said he found Jason strangling Molly and verbally threatening to kill her. He testified that he struck Jason to stop the assault, and that Molly also struck Jason with the paving brick during the encounter. Both defendants maintained that they feared for Molly's life and acted to protect her. The defense also called into question elements of the prosecution's forensic presentation, including the qualifications and conclusions of a blood spatter expert, arguing that the expert had not personally visited the crime scene and that his conclusions should be given limited weight. The defense additionally argued there was no evidence supporting a claim that Jason was planning to leave the marriage and return to Ireland with the children, which the prosecution had suggested as a possible motive. After less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict on the 9th of August, 2017. Both Molly Martins Corbett and Thomas Martins were found guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Jason Corbett. Both were sentenced to a minimum of 20 years and a maximum of 25 years in prison, consistent with the sentencing recommendation put forward by the prosecution. At sentencing, a victim impact statement written by Jack Corbett, then 13 years old, was read to the court on his behalf. In it, Jack described the impact of losing his father just 9 years after also losing his mother. Following their convictions, Molly Martins Corbett and Thomas Martins appealed to the North Carolina Court of Appeals. Their appeal raised several arguments, including a claim of juror misconduct during deliberations, and a claim that the trial court had wrongly excluded certain statements made by Jack and Sarah Corbett to investigators and social workers in the immediate aftermath of their father's death. Those statements were significant. However, approximately 9 months later, in a follow-up interview with the sheriff's office, Jack reversed his earlier statements. He said that Molly had coached him on what to say before the original interviews, and that the stories describing his father as abusive were not true. The trial court had excluded these children's statements from being used by the defense at the original 2017 trial. On appeal, the defense argued this exclusion deprived them of evidence potentially supporting the self-defense claim, since the statements, even with the later recantation, spoke to a pattern of behavior relevant to whether Jason had been violent toward Molly in the past. The North Carolina Court of Appeals sided with the defense on this issue and reversed both convictions, ordering that the case be retried, on the basis that the excluded statements should have been available for consideration. The state of North Carolina appealed that decision to the North Carolina Supreme Court. On the 12th of March, 2021, the North Carolina Supreme Court ruled, in a 4-3 decision, that Molly Martins Corbett and Thomas Martins were entitled to a new trial, upholding the Court of Appeals finding regarding the excluded children's statements. In response to the ruling, Jack and Sarah Corbett, by then adults, publicly stated their willingness to testify against Molly and Thomas Martins if their earlier statements were going to be used by the defense in a retrial. Between the 2021 Supreme Court ruling and the eventual resolution of the case, Molly Martins Corbett and Thomas Martins remained in a state of legal limbo. Their original convictions had been vacated, meaning they were, in the eyes of the law, no longer convicted of the crime, but they had not been acquitted either. A new trial loomed, with all the uncertainty, expense, and emotional toll that comes with revisiting a homicide case years after the fact. For prosecutors, a retrial carried real risk. Evidence ages. Witnesses' memories shift. Jack and Sarah Corbett, the two most important witnesses to the family dynamics preceding their father's death, would now be testifying as adults about events from their childhood, under circumstances very different from the original trial. For the defense, continuing to fight the case meant years more of legal proceedings, cost, and the possibility of a second conviction with an even longer sentence, since time already served does not guarantee leniency in a retrial. It was against this backdrop that a resolution was eventually reached. On the 30th of October, 2023, at the Davidson County Superior Court in Lexington, North Carolina, Molly Martins Corbett and Thomas Martins each entered a plea of no contest to a reduced charge of voluntary manslaughter, classified under North Carolina law as a Class D felony. In exchange, the district attorney's office agreed to drop the second-degree murder charges that would otherwise have gone back before a jury. A plea of no contest, sometimes referred to by its Latin term, means the defendant does not admit guilt outright but accepts that the state has enough evidence to likely secure a conviction and agrees to accept the legal consequences of that charge without a full trial. Given the amount of time both defendants had already spent in custody following their original 2017 convictions, the sentence attached to the reduced charge resulted in both being released from custody, having already served approximately the equivalent of the new sentence during the years since their arrest. The resolution meant that after roughly 8 years of legal proceedings, encompassing one full trial, a set of convictions, an appellate reversal, a state Supreme Court ruling, and the looming threat of a second trial, the case concluded not with a jury's verdict on the merits, but with a negotiated plea. The resolution drew strong reactions on both sides of the Atlantic. In Ireland, where Jason Corbett's case had been followed closely for nearly a decade, many viewed the plea deal as an unsatisfying end to a case that had once produced a unanimous jury verdict of murder. Members of Jason's family in Ireland had continued to raise Jack and Sarah, and had remained vocal throughout the appellate process about their belief that the original conviction reflected the truth of what happened. In 2025, a documentary produced for Netflix, examining the case in detail and featuring interviews with Molly Martins, Thomas Martins, and Jason's children, renewed public interest in the case a decade after Jason's death. The documentary presented competing accounts from those involved and reignited public debate over whether the justice system had reached a fair outcome, or whether a plea agreement had allowed two people, once convicted by a jury of murder, to walk free without ever facing that same jury's judgment again. In interviews connected to the renewed attention on the case, Jack Corbett has spoken about the complexity of his family's experience, including his own shifting statements over the years about what he witnessed as a child in the Corbett household. The killing of Jason Corbett is unusual among cases we cover on this channel, because there was never a whodunit. From the earliest hours of the investigation, both defendants acknowledged their role in Jason's death. The entire legal battle that followed, spanning a trial, an appeal, a state Supreme Court ruling, and ultimately a plea, was not about identifying a perpetrator, but about determining the legal character of an admitted killing. Was it murder, or was it a justified use of force in defense of another person? This case also illustrates how forensic details, timelines, and even the placement of a single piece of evidence, like a baseball bat's location the night before a killing, can carry enormous legal weight. It shows how a medical examiner's inability to determine an exact number of blows, due to overlapping trauma, can still support a legal argument about the proportionality of force used. And it shows how the statements of children, given in the rawest, earliest hours after losing a parent, can shape the outcome of a case years later, even after those same children later revise what they said. For the state of North Carolina, the case also became a notable example of how appellate courts weigh the exclusion of evidence, and how a 4-3 split at the state's highest court can undo a unanimous jury verdict, sending a case back to square one years after it appeared resolved. Jason Corbett's children, Jack and Sarah, lost both of their parents before reaching adulthood, first their mother to a sudden medical event, and later their father in a killing that their stepmother and grandfather admitted to committing. Their case remains one of the most closely followed homicide cases to come out of North Carolina in the past 2 decades, not because there was ever doubt about who was present in that room, but because the question of justice, in this instance, proved far more complicated than the facts of the night themselves. The case of Jason Corbett raises a question that applies well beyond North Carolina. What happens when the people responsible for a death admit to it immediately, and the entire legal system spends nearly a decade deciding not who did it, but why it happened, and what it should legally be called? A jury once decided that answer was murder. An appellate court, And then the state's highest court decided that jury never had the full picture. And in the end, the case was resolved not by a second jury, but by a negotiated plea that allowed both defendants to go free. That is the case file for Molly Martins Corbett and the killing of Jason Corbett, right here on Cold Justice. If you found this case as complicated as we did, let us know your take in the comments. Hit like if you want to see more North Carolina cases, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and we'll see you in the next case file.